You probably think the most dangerous thing in the Wild West was a high-noon duel or a stray bullet from a saloon brawl. Hollywood has convinced us that cowboys lived and died by the gun, riding off into the sunset with a whiskey flask in one hand and a Colt .45 in the other. But the reality of the frontier was far quieter and infinitely more gruesome. They had a killer out there that was silent, invisible, and responsible for more shallow graves on the Oregon Trail than every outlaw combined. Here is the thing about the American frontier that sounds completely backwards. The most pristine, crystal-clear stream you find when you are dying of thirst is often the exact thing that will kill you the fastest. Yeah, you heard that right. You could be crawling through the Mojave, lips cracked and bleeding, stumble upon a sparkling pool of water, take one desperate sip, and effectively sign your own death warrant. It wasn't poison in the traditional sense. It was geology playing a cruel joke on biology. Taking a drink from the wrong creek didn't just quench your thirst. It triggered a biological self-destruct sequence that turned the toughest frontiersmen into weeping, withered husks within hours. While movies show guys drinking cool water from their Stetsons, real cowboys knew that the clear water was often a chemical cocktail of alkali salts, arsenic, and gypsum that would strip the lining of your stomach faster than industrial cleaner. The science behind this liquid death is terrifyingly simple. The geography of the American West is essentially a massive, dried-up ocean bed loaded with mineral deposits. When water flows through the soil, it picks up magnesium sulfate, what we essentially call Epsom salts today. The concentration in some of these sweet-looking springs was about 5 times higher than what a human body can process. When you drink it, your body doesn't absorb the water. Instead, that magnesium triggers a violent evacuation response. Your intestines basically panic and try to flush the minerals out by pulling water from your organs into your gut. You end up losing massive amounts of fluid through explosive diarrhea. It's perfect irony. You drink to stop dehydration, and the water forces your body to dehydrate itself to death. Cowboys called this Gyppy Tummy, or the bloody flux, names that sound almost cute compared to the reality. Your stomach cramps so hard it feels like you've swallowed a handful of barbed wire. The electrolyte imbalance hits your brain next, causing hallucinations and tremors. You'd see tough-as-nails cattle drivers curled up in the dirt, crying for their mothers, their bodies literally wringing themselves dry from the inside out. And the worst part? Your brain plays tricks on you. As the alkali poisoning sets in, your thirst increases tenfold. You feel like you are burning up from the inside, so you crawl back to that same poisoned spring and drink more. It creates a feedback loop of destruction. Some pioneers reported finding corpses next to streams with their bellies distended, having drunk themselves to death on water that was effectively a laxative weaponized by nature. Smart trail bosses learned this the hard way. They would watch their greenhorns run toward a water hole, only to whip them back or even draw guns on them to stop them from drinking. It wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. Dying of thirst takes days. Dying from alkali poisoning takes hours, and it is an agonizing, messy, and humiliating way to go. So if the groundwater is poison, just carry your own, right? That's where the second nightmare begins. Transportation technology in the 1800s wasn't exactly NASA grade. A cowboy's canteen was the most vital piece of equipment he owned, more important than his saddle or his rifle. But keeping water drinkable in a container while riding through 100-degree heat was a logistical horror show. Most canteens were made of tin or wood, sometimes covered in wool. The wool trick was actually clever. You'd soak the cloth, and as the water evaporated from the fabric, it cooled the metal inside. Thermodynamics in action. But there was a catch. Inside that dark, warm, sloshing metal drum, microscopic life was throwing a frat party. Water sitting in a canteen for 3 days in the Texas heat didn't stay water. It became a biological soup. Algae would bloom on the interior walls. Bacteria from the local creek source would multiply exponentially in the warmth. Cowboys would take a swig of what they thought was their safe supply, only to swallow a mouthful of green slime that tasted like metallic swamp gas. To make matters worse, to prevent the metal from rusting or the wood from rotting, some manufacturers lined the insides with materials that would make modern health inspectors faint. We're talking about tar, pitch, or even lead-based solders. Over time, these materials would leach into the water. So you weren't just drinking bacteria, you were microdosing yourself with heavy metals and chemical sealants. The taste was reportedly unbearable. Diaries from the era described canteen water as tasting like warm urine mixed with gunpowder. Yet they guarded these canteens with their lives. If a canteen sprang a leak, a cowboy would plug it with anything available: pine resin, a piece of his own shirt, or even chewed-up tobacco. Sanitation was a luxury. Retention was survival. And just like the pirates at sea, fights broke out. When the communal water barrels on the chuck wagon ran low, the social order collapsed. You'd think camaraderie would hold a group together, but watching the last barrel dwindle turned men into animals. There are records of shootings over a ladle of brown, tepid water that today you wouldn't even use to wash your car. When the canteens ran dry and the only water around was a suspicious, milky white alkali pond, desperate cowboys started trying to hack the system. Their first instinct was filtration. They assumed if they could just strain out the bad stuff, the water would be safe. They were dead wrong. But God, did they try? The most common failed technique was the coyote hole. Instead of drinking directly from the stagnant pond, cowboys would dig a hole in the sand about 10 feet away from the water's edge. The theory was that the water would seep through the sand and filter itself into the fresh hole, coming out clean. It makes logical sense, right? Sand is a natural filter. The water that filled these holes usually looked clearer and cooler than the scum-topped pond. But dissolved minerals don't care about sand. The magnesium and arsenic flowed right through the soil lattice. Cowboys would high-five each other for their ingenuity, drink the clear water from the coyote hole, and be doubled over in agony 2 hours later. Then there was the boiling myth. We all know boiling kills bacteria. It's survival 101. But boiling does absolutely nothing to remove mineral poisons. In fact, it makes it worse. When you boil alkali water, the water evaporates as steam, but the minerals stay behind. You are essentially concentrating the poison, turning a dangerous drink into a toxic syrup. Plus, think about the logistics. You are on the high plains. There are no trees. The only fuel is dried buffalo chips. Yes, poop. Who wants to spend an hour burning buffalo dung to boil water that ends up tasting like concentrated chalk and still gives you the runs? Most didn't bother. They just gambled with their guts. Some tried masking the danger with alcohol. The myth of the cowboy constantly drinking whiskey wasn't just about alcoholism. It was often an attempt to sterilize the water. They'd mix cheap rot-gut whiskey into their canteens. While the alcohol might have killed a few germs, it also acted as a diuretic, making them urinate more and accelerating dehydration. It was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. But here is where the story gets wild. Just like the pirates used charcoal and silver, cowboys and native guides stumbled upon a biohack that actually worked. It involved the most abundant, annoying plant in the desert, the prickly pear cactus. This wasn't just old wives' tales. It was legit organic chemistry. Cowboys learned to slice open the pads of the prickly pear and toss them into a bucket of muddy, alkali-ridden water. To the uneducated eye, it looked like making soup out of garbage. But the cactus contains a thick, gooey substance called mucilage. This mucilage acts as a natural flocculant. That's a fancy science word meaning a substance that makes suspended particles clump together. The sticky cactus goo would bind to the sediment, dirt, and even some of the heavy mineral ions, causing them to become heavy and sink to the bottom of the bucket. Within an hour, a bucket of brown, poisonous sludge would separate. A thick layer of muck would settle at the bottom, leaving relatively clear, drinkable water on top. It didn't remove 100% of the dissolved salts, but it removed enough of the suspended solids to make the water tolerable. It tasted like plant slime, sure, but it stayed down. This technique was likely learned from indigenous tribes who had mastered desert survival centuries before the first cattle drive. The cowboys didn't understand ionic bonding or molecular coagulation. They just knew that if you threw a cactus in the pot, you didn't die of the flux the next day. This became a standard procedure for savvy trail bosses. You arrive at a mud hole, you harvest cactus, you wait. Patience became a survival skill. The hotheads who drank straight from the source got sick. The ones who waited for the cactus slime to do its magic survived to reach Abilene. Then there was the coffee. You've seen it in every Western movie. The pot of black sludge sitting on the fire 24/7. But Cowboy Coffee wasn't just a caffeine delivery system. It was accidentally one of the most effective water sterilization methods in history. Cowboys didn't brew coffee like your local barista. They boiled the living hell out of it. They would throw grounds into water and let it rolling boil for up to half an hour. Then they'd often just add more water and grounds to the old sludge and boil it again. This aggressive, excessive boiling was overkill for flavor. It tasted like battery acid. But it was perfect for safety. That sustained high heat killed every parasite, amoeba, and cholera bacterium in the water. The sheer bitterness of the coffee beans masked the alkaline taste of the bad water. But wait, there is a weird physics trick they used to clear it up. After boiling this muddy mess, the coffee would be full of grounds and floating debris. To fix this, cowboys would crush up eggshells, if they had them, or pour a cup of cold water into the boiling pot. The cold water shock disrupted the convection currents, causing the grounds to settle instantly to the bottom. The eggshells? They are alkaline, calcium carbonate. If the water was acidic or sour, the shells neutralized the pH, mellowing the flavor. If the water was too alkaline, well, the coffee was strong enough to punch through it. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee became the currency of the West, not just because it gave energy, but because the ritual of making it, boiling, settling, waiting, inadvertently saved thousands from dysentery. If you saw a cowboy drinking water, you worried. If you saw him drinking coffee, you knew he was safe. When science, cactus, and coffee failed, cowboys relied on the ultimate biosensor, their horses. There was a golden rule on the trail. Never drink from a hole the horses won't touch. Horses have a sense of smell and taste for water that puts humans to shame. A horse can smell the metallic tang of arsenic or the sulfurous stench of bad alkali from a distance. If a thirst-crazed herd of cattle or horses arrived at a stream and refused to drink, skittishly sniffing the edge and backing away, the cowboys knew to stay the hell away. However, This rule had a terrifying exception: leeches. Horses are terrified of leeches. A horse might refuse perfectly good water because it senses leeches, which could attach to the inside of their nose or throat. A desperate cowboy might see the horse refuse, assume the water is poison, and die of thirst next to a safe spring. Conversely, some animals, like mules, were less picky. A mule might drink water that was borderline toxic. Relying on the animal was a gamble, but it was often the only litmus test they had. Smart cowboys learned to read the landscape. They looked for life. If a water hole had frogs, bugs, and minnows, it was usually safe. If the water was crystal clear, surrounded by a ring of white crust, and absolutely devoid of insects or bird life, that was the silent killer. The absence of life was the biggest warning sign of all. Just like the pirates with their charred barrels, cowboys eventually figured out that the campfire itself held the key to clean water. They didn't have the luxury of charring giant barrels, but they had charcoal in abundance every morning. Some innovative survivalists would take a tin can, punch small holes in the bottom, and fill it with layers of grass, sand, and crushed charcoal from the previous night's fire. They would pour the nasty creek water through this makeshift tower. The grass caught the big chunks of moss and bugs. The sand caught the finer silt. But the charcoal? That was the magic. Activated carbon, which is basically what charcoal is, creates a massive surface area that traps chemical impurities and bacteria. It adsorbs toxins. The water that dripped out the bottom wasn't Evian, but it was significantly stripped of the organic compounds that caused the worst stomach illnesses. It took forever. Drip, 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 but it worked. The irony is that they were using the same technology that is inside your modern Brita filter today. They just looked like lunatics doing it, straining mud through a dirty sock filled with burnt wood. But in a land where a single cup of bad water meant a slow, cramping death, looking like a lunatic was a small price to pay. The romantic image of the cowboy is one of freedom and mastery over nature. But the truth is, they were constantly at war with the most basic element of life. They weren't just fighting Comanches or rustlers. They were fighting geology. Every drink was a calculated risk. They survived by becoming amateur chemists, using cactus snot to clear sediment, turning coffee making into a sterilization ritual, and reading the behavior of their horses like a survival manual. The next time you watch a Western and see a hero casually dip his face into a stream, remember the reality. That water was likely a laxative cocktail loaded with arsenic. The real heroes of the West weren't the ones with the fastest draw. They were the ones who had the patience to boil their water, filter it through charcoal, and wait for the mud to settle. In the end, the most valuable thing in a cowboy's saddlebag wasn't gold dust or ammunition. It was the knowledge of which creek would keep you alive and which one would kill you before the sun went down. Survival wasn't about being tough. It was about knowing that sometimes the clearest water hides the darkest secrets.